bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Well, hello, everybody. We have now achieved on Society and the State triple digits. Thank you for joining us and sticking with us. We are now on episode 100. Brian and I had a conversation about, a guest we might want to have on to celebrate that milestone. And Brian, of course, the first answer was?
We thought Ron Paul.
Ron Paul.
Nobody but Ron Paul would do for this.
So we are honored to have Dr. Paul on the podcast to join us today. Dr. Paul, thank you very much for spending some time with us.
It's nice to be with you.
So, you're a man who has had a lot of influence on the liberty movement. Today, we just want to kind of check in with you and get your thoughts on where we stand, where we're going, and what recommendations you might have moving forward. So let me first ask you. You were in Congress for quite a while, sounding off this message of freedom when far fewer people were listening. Social media wasn't really that prevalent or didn't exist. Things have changed. Where do you feel, looking back, that the liberty movement has gone from your time back in Congress to today?
Well, I think we've made tremendous strides. The first years I was there in the 1970s, they never heard of libertarian or Austrian economics, or they never had any concern about the Federal Reserve. They all thought that we needed more drug laws and that states couldn't take care of things. And so we've made a lot of progress, and I think there's a big change. Our big problem is that we don't get the attention, which is okay if you understand it, but the attention comes from the media, which has no interest. Matter of fact, they are an enemy of liberty, and also the politicians in Washington. We know our friends up there, but I imagine we could find about 10 or 15 at the most that we consider close allies and individuals who understand the issues. But so you don't hear it from them. But when it comes to groups like yours, Connor, and what you've done and others, I've been so impressed that a lot of people gave me credit for speaking out and campaigning in 2 presidential campaigns, and yet I'm still running into people all the time who are either in office or running for state house or starting another organization, people like you, and that's where I become very optimistic. So I think the ideas are out there, and it's an idea, of course, as time has come, and I think we're competing, and it's sort of the opposition. They're really bankrupt economically and intellectually. They're bankrupt, and then you have a lot of noise from people who say, well, what we need is socialism. Well, if all of a sudden America votes for socialism, then we don't have much chance. But they're not going to. All they need is exposure, and that's why I want activism within the liberty movement.
We definitely want to talk to you in a few minutes about that activism side and what thoughts you have. But I want to take this opportunity to touch on something you brought up and then quickly moved away from, and that is this lasting impact that your presidential campaigns have had. Tom Woods, who was our episode number 1 guest to help us kick things off here, a great friend of what we're doing. He, as you may know, was giving a speech recently. I believe this was at the Libertarian National Convention. There was a separate event that was organized, and he said this many times before on his podcast and in events where he says, look, no one talks about the lasting impact of, Newt Gingrich. No one talks about any of these other, people that ran, the Rudy Giuliani, people who he made a lasting impression on. But things were different with your campaigns. I know you're a humble guy. You're going to claim this, you don't have the credit. It's about the ideas. But what are your thoughts personally for having helped spearhead? I mean, myself personally, I've shared with you before that the whole reason I do any of what I do now is because I saw the documentary Freedom to Fascism by the late Aaron Rousseau. This was about 2006, and I'm watching this being new to a lot of these ideas, and I see this older gentleman. I'm not familiar with him. He's making a whole lot of sense. Of course, this is you. I go Google you, and the rest is history, where those ideas that you were for a long time advocating, perhaps to few people who were listening, began to pick up. So a personal question. How do you personally feel looking back and seeing the lasting impact your work has had in seeing, as you point out, so many people who ran for office, started organizations, doing good work, because of the ideas they encountered through you. How does that make you feel, and what thoughts do you have about that?
Well, I have to be pleased, but more importantly, I spend more time being surprised because I went with. But some people ask me, didn't it become very frustrating to be in Washington? How many laws did you pass? You didn't do this, and you didn't do that. You didn't become a chairman. And I said, well, I just went with low expectations. Of course, low expectations that I was going to mold myself and be successful in the political sense. So I'm still surprised that the reception has been this good, but of course, very, very pleased. And I think that people, have responded, and that has encouraged me. And people will say, well, now that you've awoken me, what do I do? What do I do? And if you'd have called me a few years ago, and if you'd have said, oh, Ron, what should I do now? What do I do? You got me, and I agree with you. I wouldn't have been able to come up with what you've done. I mean, yours is unique and different, and it's great. So everybody has to do their share, but I also do mention that people have to study and understand the issues and then be pleasantly surprised. But I keep getting surprised every single day on all the people that are joining us. So, and I think it's gives me a lot of encouragement.
Dr. Paul, your example likewise has influenced me as it has Connor. One of the questions I have for you, because I'm a believer in the power of example. When you were in Washington, D.C., you were one of the very rare exceptions of people who did not get assimilated by the political Borg and made to play the game along with everybody else. That's really rare. Where did you find the foundation, or how did you build the foundation that you stood on that allowed you to stay true to your principles even when it was unpopular to do so?
Well, I think it was the motivation to get involved in politics. People said, when did you decide to give up medicine and become a politician? I says, I absolutely never did that because in my mind, I still think of myself as a physician. And I never gave up anything, but I wanted to speak out. But my goal wasn't to be in office. So when young people come and say, Ron, Paul, I like what you're doing. And he says, tell me what I have to do to become a congressman. And I said, the first thing you do is you give up this idea that should never be your goal, because then you join the crowd even before you get there. You go and you work your way up the ranks, you learn how to raise money, you learn how to organize, and you do all these things, and then you are already into the establishment because you're looking for support from the special interest. I think to go with an idea that it's just a place where I've been put to speak out on some issues, and I really didn't expect it. I didn't expect to go, and I went and I did. I didn't expect to stay very long. As a matter of fact, I quit after 4 terms and stayed out for 12 years. I just didn't think that was the biggest thing in the world for me. So I think it's the goals that people have, and I just don't like it when the goal is to be in Congress, and that's a lousy goal. To be there is when you're going to sell out to get there, and then when you are, you say, well, yeah, I know, but I need to do what is necessary to get reelected because I'm doing all these wonderful things. So then they start, playing game with the leadership, vote the way the leadership wants in order to get the money for the district so he stays popular. So they join the crowd. So I think it's an individual decision. I just think it would have been more bizarre and more gut-wrenching if I would have done anything differently. People say, well, how did you resist it? No, it was very easy for me to, because I didn't want to have any part of them. So I think it's what people's goals are, and then like I said, I was surprised that, it worked. When I first announced the very first time in the early 1970s, I told my wife, I said, I'm going to do this to speak out, and she claimed that could be dangerous because she says you'll probably get elected. So I assured her that wouldn't happen because they don't want to elect somebody that's getting rid of the political Santa Claus that provides everything for everybody. It doesn't cost very much, and that means the rich and the poor that benefit by government. And of course, it's progressed; it hasn't slowed up, and now we face a major crisis. And that means our efforts are more crucial than ever before, and the more people we can get over to our side, the better. But I work on the assumption that you don't have to get depressed over, well, we need 51% to do anything. No, you don't. You just need people in the right places. You didn't have to get 51% to put your programs together. You just did it, and you're influencing people. So that's what's important. It's the people who think about issues and present them and understand them and convert people. And that happened on a rare occasion in Congress. I was always taught that you don't take people by the collar and say, why are you doing this? You can't use pressure of any sort. But if you're knowledgeable and you know what's going on, I'm sure the two of you have experienced it already, people will come and ask you because they figure, oh, you know something about this. Well, how would you solve this problem? And on a few occasions, I had members of Congress that would come and would say, why are you voting by yourself? And I sat with them and quietly explained to it. And very often, on a rare occasion, but very often those people I talked to would change their voting patterns.
Now, Dr. Paul, you brought up your wife suggesting that, careful, you might get elected, and sure enough, you will. And I often wonder about the spouses, the family members, because getting involved, especially taking a sometimes controversial stand, a minority stand, an aggressive stand to stand up for our rights is not without cost. I mean, as your son Rand has seen at great personal cost of actually being, attacked and most recently having a death threat. And there's a toxic environment in which Trump supporters are being kicked out and assaulted and so forth. From my experience, a lot of people care about these ideas, but they are disinclined to engage or to speak up for fear of, stoking controversy or being contentious or having somebody else not like what they do. What element, how much was courage required in what you've done, and do you think that courage is required today in terms of standing up for what you believe in, despite there being a potential blowback or some sacrifice that may be required?
Well, in my case, it would have taken a lot of brainwashing to have me do anything else because I wouldn't have been pleased with it, and I couldn't have done it. So there's a difference. Now, as far as ramifications, my wife still is very sensitive. If you notice, I still get attacked, and sometimes I say, well, they have the problem, they don't understand, and this sort of thing, and I try to ignore it, but my wife still takes it pretty seriously, and supporters become very, very strong, defenders more so than I. Because if they don't listen to reason, I just don't bother with them. I offer it if they're interested in it. That's why, waiting for somebody to say, what are the answers to this, and how do you do that? Then all of a sudden their minds are opened up and they are paying attention. And then the personal satisfaction has to be when you figure, I reached him, one person. But I always thought it was going to be one at a time, a few people here. When I was first in Congress, I can remember being invited to a college campus to talk about the issues, and they recognized I was voting differently. And if I got 15 or 20 out on a college campus, I figured, well, maybe there'll be somebody there that's going to change their tune. And that's the way it was for a lot of years. Then all of a sudden, this shock came to me that in the campaign, and there was this forum in the debates that to me it was just astounding. I was always an optimist, but I wasn't optimistic that there were that many people out there, and evidently there were and there are, and they're looking for somebody just to guide them a little bit.
Now, let me touch on that brief point. I know Brian's got another question, but the joke about those of us in the liberty movement is that it's like cat herding, right? Everyone is independent, wants to go their own way, get off my lawn, don't tread on me, etc. And it seems to me that after your campaigns have passed, there's a lot more factionalization in the freedom movement. There's a lot more infighting. I've never been a member of the Libertarian Party, but what has been going on inside that party most recently, I think, is emblematic of this problem I'm talking about, where there's the purity tests and you're not quite with us, and the Mises versus the Cato and everything like that. And my question for you is, how do we get away from that? It seems like when you were running for president, we had this kind of leader. We had someone to rally us together. There was a lot more unity in the freedom movement. People, as you've pointed out many times, of different socioeconomic backgrounds, different political backgrounds, coming together under this banner of freedom that you were the champion of for a time very publicly. And now that season is over, there's a little bit more, or perhaps a lot more, of this factionalization. Do we need another Ron Paul to kind of galvanize everybody together in unity, or absent that, strong leader and voice and kind of the face of freedom, is there a way to kind of bring people together under that banner to work together?
We need more people like Connor and you to go out there and do these things and reach people. That makes a difference. When I talked after debate in Detroit, Michigan, I went over to Ann Arbor, and that is where the students started shouting back, "End the Fed, end the Fed," and they started burning Federal Reserve notes. And I never even brought it up in the speeches, and barely did. And I said, so there was a movement going on, and that's why it's an intellectual movement. This factionalism is human nature. It's always going to be there. It was there, just think of the fights that the founders had, with Jefferson and Hamilton. They fought tooth and nails about big government and little government. So it's always going to be there. And even throughout history, they have been pretty vicious fights and arguments. But I still think that it's an intellectual adventure. It's not a political adventure. And those individuals who get involved in politics is over power and personalities and all. But I hope I've convinced some people that the answer can be found in libertarianism, the understanding of what non-aggression means, that it brings people together. Freedom is popular. And I try to explain to people that it sort of opens up the doors. Like one thing that's annoying me right now is what has happened is we've destroyed the middle road. Nobody's allowed to be in the middle. Everybody's extreme on the right, extreme on the left, and there's this fighting and fuming. What we have to do is build the middle, and I think the middle is too big. I think that's where everybody is. That's who runs the government. They've sold out on everything. You don't have a progressive that defends civil liberties or a good foreign policy, and you don't have conservatives, doing a very good job, and they go off the beam. But if you can explain that if we have our liberty, then we can have our own life, and we can have a different social life, a different religious life, a different everything at no cost. It's if you give up one thing, and that is give up the use of force, and that means that a liberal can live their own life, and you might disagree with them socially and religiously, and so it brings these people together. But this idea, and then you don't have to care about, liberals do this and conservatives do this, and he doesn't go to church and we go to church, and they have the definition of marriage, which is different, and all those kind of things. But I don't think it's a lack of the mainstream middle class, or the middle class, the in between. I think that's a big compromise, and they don't believe in anything except power and influence, and those ideas are bankrupt, and also the country is bankrupt. I think what we have to, and a lot of people now. First off, sounds good. That's idealistic, but the socialists and the liberals aren't going to be willing to give up force and violence to have their way on how to spend money, and the conservatives aren't going to give up any ground on some of the social issues and on war. They're not going to give up the issue of non-intervention in war. But I sincerely believe that if people want to tolerate others, that so often what we think is the conservatives have to convince liberals that they have to live the way they do, and liberals want to convince other people that they're too fundamentalist, and they have these religious views, and they're too conservative, and they have these weird ideas. You have to just let them go, but you cannot use force and violence and theft, and that is exactly what they do. And it's very simple. It's the principles have been around for a long time. Don't lie, cheat, steal, hurt people, and don't murder. we're not allowed to do that.
That's what we teach our kids.
That can be found in all the great religions. You don't even have to get into the details of religions, but most of them admitted that you're not supposed to that love and peace is worthwhile. At least a lot of people pay lip service to it. But then there's a distortion of all those religious. But you have to accept this rule that you can't initiate violence against others to have your way.
Dr. Paul, Connor takes this very seriously as a parent. I do as well. We want to teach our kids to cherish and to embrace the principles of liberty in the understanding that it's easier to teach them at a young age than to try to correct misconceptions they've been indoctrinated with all their lives as adults. In the vein of helping young people understand and cherish the principles of liberty, what's your best advice to the young people who will be doing some of the heavy lifting in the years ahead?
That's an interesting question, because I keep thinking that I grew up and maintain certain values. And I'm sure the family had a lot to do with it, the parents. But I can't ever remember any time either parent ever talked to me about these important issues. It was almost like osmosis. It was almost like we as kids, there were 5 boys, and we were all within 7 years. So we were very, very close, and we got into our usual trouble and all. But there was also an understanding. Of course, we all went to church every week, and we all knew, and I think we came up and had an understanding. But it was never this. I don't think it has to be lecturing. I think there can be answering and things, but if there's questions. But I think, in other words, I guess what I'm talking about is setting an example for kids and the way the kids are treated. When my wife and I talk about it, I said, the one thing is about, my parents were, quiet, hardworking. They taught the work ethic. They didn't lecture me on the work ethic. It was just there. So most of us went out and delivered papers and mowed lawns and took care of ourselves and assumed responsibility. I can remember one thing that I talk about on this assumption that it just is there. My dad had a small dairy, and when we were 16 and we could drive a truck, I thought that was big. I felt very much of an adult. But the milk route and the trucks were very important. They were our livelihood. But my dad entrusted me to take a load of milk and go to a couple hundred houses and deliver that milk at the age of 16. And I always marveled at that. When I look back at that time, I knew I could do it because we were helpers, But it's something that people pass down without worrying about it. Deal with the problems when they come and set examples and all. But our big problem is the examples aren't very good today. When you think about the problem of the family, I mean, that is a lot tougher. So they have to find individuals and models to follow, maybe outside the family. But just think of our inner cities that they were. I mean, so that problem is not a political problem. So much of what I see, it's a family problem. There's a moral crisis out there, which really it leads to political problems. But the problem is the morality of the people, and I think it was Adams that said that without morality without morality, you can't have liberty. There's an amount of responsibility. So can you have liberty and then lecture everybody about morality? I don't think it works that way very well. I think that being a moral nation is pretty important. And then maybe it's an environment where you can develop liberty. But I think you have to be involved in both. Other thing I was utterly amazed at the campaign is people would come up and say, this is good. I know about the Fed and all this. But they said something else, and I still haven't figured out. They claim I've changed their whole attitude about life. They looked at life differently. I said, well, and they're always optimistic. And I said, well, I tell you about all the problems. I tell you, the country's bankrupt. There's too many wars and all this. And then I finally figured it out. What they're looking for is truth. And but I always tried to close any type of talk like that. Yes, there's a lot of problems, and it's serious with an optimistic answer. But 90% of what I say, if you've heard me speak, is telling you about the problem. The 10% is, it's not complicated. I say, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? I say, well, you could start by just having people who read the Constitution. That would be a bit of a start, and have people who believe in it.
What you've said, Dr. Paul, is a great segue to the last question I wanted to ask you, and that is, if you put on your prognostication cap, you think 10 or 20 or 30 years forward in the future, are you optimistic about the future? Do you think we will forever be the oppressed, minority that is just having a purpose in spreading the ideas, or do you envision a future in which these ideas, take root, where the Fed is audited, where maybe, blockchain tech, Bitcoin type stuff actually dismantles some of the power? Do you realistically see a path forward for substantially increased freedom, or do you feel that we're just going to be serving this purpose of educating and reaching people individually, even though we may not be impacting things on a systemic level?
No, I'm optimistic, and I write about how much progress we've made in 100, 200 years in the sense of technology. Fantastic, and there's been progress, on how people live and the type of wealth that's around. But I always lament the fact that technology has been used to fight war and kill people too. But I don't see any reason why we can't have, the advancements that we have intellectually couldn't be used for promoting peace and prosperity. And that's why I persist on it. Yeah, I think that I think we are making progress. 100 years ago, they never had a word called Austrian economics. Even in 1976, when I first went to Washington, nobody had heard of it. People would come up and say, "What are you doing? You're voting with a bunch of radical leftists on this issue." So no, I think the progress is there. But if this can't be interpreted to think that in the next 4 years we're going to have peace and prosperity, I think we're going to have a lot of the opposite. I mean, we're going to pay the bill, and it's desperate that we rally the troops so that intellectually we have an alternative. Right now, we don't want to let ourselves to become Venezuela. I mean, the things that Venezuela could do are all known, but it hasn't happened yet. But there's no reason why it can't happen. And I think that the only thing that I can do about it is try to explain why liberty is so much better than authoritarianism. That's the big difference. You want a bunch of authoritarians, and they're totally in charge. They're in charge of the media or universities and in Washington. But voluntarism is alive and well, and people are recognizing it. And I like what Young Americans for Liberty is doing. They're involved in spreading a message. I like what you guys are doing. I think there's a lot out there that we should be optimistic about.
Dr. Paul, it's been an honor. Brian and I are very ecstatic to have joined you, or you joined us for our 100th episode. You're continuing to do great work. You've inspired many who are now harvesting the seeds that have been planted and doing a lot of good work in your name and in your wake. And so we're very excited to have chatted with you. Keep up the great work and keep speaking out. We deeply appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. It was nice being with you.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.